Hello and welcome to Jan. So Jan, you are a trauma resolution therapist, you're an embodiment coach, you are a sister circle facilitator, and you also offer targeted cryotherapy and body work, and you're from Cryo Massage, aren't you?
Hello. Hi,
Hello.
Leah.
And welcome. Thank you. I'm really looking forward to our talk today. I know you've got a lot to share. So just to remind our audience first at home that this is a fundraising event. So if you find any value in this video, which I'm sure you're going to, we'd really encourage you to make a donation to Great Ormond Street Children's Hospital's Brighter Future Fund. The link is in the show notes, and all of the donations made for this event will go towards Great Ormond Street's strategy for fighting childhood cancer. So a really important cause to be part of supporting. So to kick off our talk then today, Jan, I'd like to ask you, as I've asked all the speakers, what does grief and trauma mean to you?
Okay, grief and trauma. Gosh, I always think grief is part of trauma. Trauma can be a loss. It can be a loss of a limb. It could be loss of life. It could be a loss of a loved one. It can be loss of identity. And there's a grieving process to that, I do believe. For myself, trauma's been the hallmark of my life in a way, actually. Without going into the detail, I don't want to upset anybody. I don't want to traumatize anyone. We can traumatize people through our stories, through secondhand means, through telling our stories. I had a very traumatic childhood in many ways, through my early childhood into my teenage years. And then I spent my 20s and 30s basically managing my traumas in the worst possible ways, actually. So I can teach people or share with people how not to manage your traumas. But of course, I didn't know then. I was a young girl. I went out into the world at 18, looked for my way, found my way through life, navigated as best as I could. But I was pretty lost, didn't have a clue about life, felt quite empty, lost, had this massive abyss, this black hole within me, which I think it can be a hallmark of trauma, actually. No identity, no sense of myself, who I was. That all got stripped away due to what happened to me in childhood. And I tried to navigate through life as best as I could. So I got into addictions, big addictive strategies to help me fill the hole, I guess, fill those gaps, you know, fill that sense of emptiness, loss. I felt contaminated. I felt, you know, unclean in a way. So it wasn't a safe place to be in my body. And so now I understand, I have the awareness through what I've done since. But at the time, I was a youngster. I went out in the world. I got into drinking lots. I got into drugs, promiscuous behaviors, crazy stuff. I was tripping all over the planet. I was constantly running away from myself. I now understand that I abandoned myself over and over again in any which way I could. I also was a fully functioning adult, by the way. You know, I did show up in life, paid my taxes, worked. I didn't drop out altogether. But I just had this massive emptiness and loss and had no idea who I was. I didn't trust myself, so I didn't trust anybody in the world. So I had these big walls of protective mechanisms to keep me split from people, but all the while felt lonely, lost, scared, abandoned. And yeah, those addictive tendencies continued in any way, shape or form that they could. So I had issues with food. I was a caffeine addict. When the drink became too much and I had some hair-raising experiences, then I just transmuted the addiction into work. So I became a workaholic. So all of these strategies, now I understand, kept me from myself, so kept me on the external of myself. I was looking out there all the time for the answers to life. I watched people, how they lived. How did they navigate through life? They seemed happy. Why was I never happy? Whatever I did, I went to university, I got a degree, I got postgraduate qualifications, I did well in my jobs, I thrived, I showed up and everybody thought I was okay. And I did really high responsible, high stress jobs. I think that was an addiction as well. You can be addicted to stress when you've been traumatized as a kid because you're in that state of fight, flight, fright all the time. But also I recognized other trauma states that I lived my life from, such as fawning. So I would be a chameleon, I'd show up for everybody else, I'd please everybody else, but again, perpetuated that sense of no idea who I am in all of that, and freeze. I was frozen from myself. I was cut off. I made that conscious decision to move into my head and live in my head and operate like an automaton, in fact, because it wasn't safe to be in the body at all. And so that's how I lived my life until I realized, come on, we need to do something here. I'm still not happy. I'm 35, peddling these old trauma states, trauma strategies.
Yeah.
And of course they didn't work because they were never going to work. So I got into talking therapies. I've done about 15 years of talking therapies since. I'm now mid-50s. So I've spent the past 20 years moving from real self-destructive habits of perpetuating my traumas. And of course, trauma begets trauma, unfortunately. So I was creating problems upon problems rather than stripping away and getting to the root cause. And so I moved into various types of talking therapies, and that served for a while. So I have spent the last 20 years on my journey of healing, but even healing can become a bit of an addiction, so I'd be reading all the books, attending all the conferences, listening to the podcasts, reading books upon books, and understanding cognitively all about my traumas. I then got it, what had happened to me and why I behaved in the ways I did through my 20s and 30s. But of course, this becomes a bit of a perpetual, journey as well, because I always felt broken. So the destination was never going to be arrived at, no matter what I did. All these healing strategies and trauma therapies that I engaged in weren't really hitting the spot either, because they kept me in my head, So I think that's a pernicious kind of misconception, actually, that being on your journey of healing is going to, be the magic bullet. In a way, it can perpetuate the traumas as well. And I think while trauma, talking therapies have their place, they can, you can end up reliving your traumas over and over again, because you're bringing them out, you're talking about them, you're recreating the traumas through externalizing them and talking about them, So in the last 8 to 10 years, I've shifted subtly from talking therapies, which have their place. I'm not denigrating those in the least, actually. They had their place, they helped me enormously, and that's where I had to be, to move on. I've increasingly moved into body work. And I've realized, from learning all about neuroscience, I follow Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory. That's the premise of my work. Somatic experiencing by Peter Levine, the greats like Gabor Mate's addictions work, and Bessel van der Kolk, his Body Keeps the Score. He's a big advocate of body work, of massage. So the last 6 years or so, I've really focused on embodiment and healing through the body. And I've come to realize that, trauma is live in the body. It can be sitting there as ambient trauma until we get triggered. So no amount of talking therapies will sort us out, in an embodied way. So I've come, for me, to learn that, embodiment is the key for deep, deep healing. And so I practice lots and lots of embodiment practice, conscious connected breath work I do every week now. I do cold water therapy every week. Hot yoga, lots of embodiment stuff. I do womb healing. I've been doing that for 6 months now. So I think we spiral back to our traumas, our original traumas, but just go deeper into, their manifestations, be they mental, emotional, physical, energetic, spiritual. And we keep going back and just digging deeper and unraveling and bringing out, the original traumas and coming to resolution with those. But for me, it's been embodiment that has been the most effective, I would say, for me. Yeah.
And that really it's been really interesting to hear your journey to this kind of to the work you're doing. And I'm sure a lot of people can really connect with a lot of what you've said, because I think our experiences, although everyone will experience something very different, our reactions and potentially some of the kind of mechanisms we fall into, like addictive behaviors or things we kind of substitute with, are probably quite similar. Everyone is different and every experience is different, but like you say, getting addictive, not even realizing potentially you're addicted to stress or addicted to kind of to work, and giving yourself this distraction, basically. And it's also really interesting to hear, because I really agree with you, and this is a big part of why I've created this event. It's about bringing all of the support available to you into the big picture and kind of seeing what's right for you and exploring what's right for you, because what is right for you at one time in your life isn't going to be right at another time. What is right on one part of your journey isn't going to be, but everything kind of has its role to play, doesn't it? And it's really good to hear you giving such kind of alive examples of exactly that we need different support at different times.
Absolutely.
And it needs to resonate.
Yeah, and we're dynamic beings, of course, aren't we? So what works, in your 20s is not going to work in your 40s. And it's all a journey in a way, as I said, of unraveling. So we go to deeper levels. So as I said, the talking therapies, I needed those absolutely, even though I've heard maybe 15 years in psychotherapy. Did that fail? Was that something wrong? Did they keep you in therapy? What went wrong there? But for me, nothing went wrong. That's what I needed to do to process on a cognitive level, something that I then laid the foundations for to dive deeper later and to go deeper into the body, because it never felt safe for me to be in my body. So there was infinite wisdom there in me, keeping myself in my head, because it felt still too dangerous, even after years of psychotherapy, to dive deeper and to drop into the body, because it's it can be, even with the beautiful touch, of a massage treatment or a trauma resolution therapy that I might do with somebody, we might trigger, even through righteous, beautiful, safe touch, we might trigger into the depths of their trauma. And they might realize what they never had, and that taps into the grief of the loss of what they never had. And so it's a very, very sacred almost and special and tentative process of what we tap into with the trauma there. And we're all different at the end of the day, of course, and your traumas are different to mine, and how we react to them, of course, are very different. So there's different times in our lives when we're ready to receive whatever it is. And I think ultimately the body holds that wisdom. Our brain is fantastic, but it's a computer program at the end of the day. It's an amazing tool. Again, not to denigrate the brain, but it's just made up of old paradigms, old beliefs, often second hand, third hand, fourth hand. So it's a great big computer program, and it's old. Ultimately, it's not really dynamic. Whereas the body, if we tune into our body wisdom, it's always alive, it's always present, because we only come into presence through the body. If we're in the head, we're in the future, or we're in the past. We tend not to be present when we're in our heads. But if we drop into that beautiful body wisdom, that's where we can access our truths, and our truths are different, of course. Mine is different to yours. But it's coming to trust in that body wisdom. And that can take a long time as well, because if traumatized people have spent a long time avoiding themselves and not trusting themselves, which I never did for a long, long time. It's only in the last couple of years I've come to trust in me. And now I understand why I was tripping around the world, lost. I never had that anchor. I never had that compass, because I didn't trust myself. So how could I trust anybody else in the world? So I was coming from those old paradigms of fear states and mistrust, because nobody was at home, as I say, and you come home through the body at the end of the day.
Yeah, definitely. I really agree. And I think also what all of what you're saying, and like we were talking about the difference in, our reactions to certain things, whether it's an emotional reaction, physical reaction. And I think, it's just a reminder how gentle we need to be on ourselves, and how we observe what comes up for us without judgment. And that's a really important part of healing, I think, is just to understand what's coming up for you and not kind of think, oh, why am I always doing this? Or why can't I this? Why can't that? Really understanding that this is a communication and it needs to be listened to. It needs to be, treated in a gentle way by yourself. As that's even more important, I think, than anyone else. If you treating yourself in a very gentle, loving way, and then that kind of opens the doors then for you to be able to access the support and the guidance from others to tap into your internal tools.
I think that's everything, to be honest, Leah. And again, it comes from safety. If you don't feel safe in the body, you're not going to listen to yourself. We'll just be operating from those old patterns and mindsets of maybe the primary caregivers that weren't the best for us. So we take on board all of their beliefs, mindsets, which are often, they turn into our inner critics, on our worst enemy. And we can be our own worst enemy ultimately. And if our internal states are an unhappy place because we beat ourselves up the whole time and flagellate ourselves continually, no wonder we wouldn't want to be there, and we'd be tripping about wanting to be anywhere else but at home within ourselves.
Yeah.
So cultivating that self-love, it can sound a bit fluffy sometimes, but ultimately it's self-care, it's care of self, it's honoring ourselves and coming to trust in ourselves ultimately, because our internal world is more important than our external world, massively, because how we talk to ourselves is the most of the time, isn't it? How we translate the world with our filters, and we can start to clean up our filters if we wish to. If we come home and trust ourselves, then we can start to question every belief we might have. And is it serving me now? I'm 54 now. What served me when I was 20 is not serving me at 54. I'm an adult now in my own right. But if I'm still operating from those old paradigms, that's not going to help me in the least. And then I can begin to clean up my act and say, well, that was my dad's belief, or my mum's, or the teacher at primary school. I'll let that go with love and compassion, and I'll choose to come home and be my own cheerleader, because ultimately that's what we want to be, our biggest fan. And that's self-care. And then that ripples out into the world, because we then start to make better decisions for ourselves. But if we're constantly beating ourselves up, then of course we don't want to be there. We'll try anything, to escape. And of course, distractions everywhere now. We can do it, on our phones, on the computer, anything. We can live a life externally so easily now. And indeed, it's encouraged by society, unfortunately. Workaholism, being stressed is the buzzword, and everybody's stressed, and it's almost like a badge of honor. And it's, hell no, come home to yourself, start looking after yourself and loving yourself, and see the external world reflect that inner belief. And that's really important to be able to do that. But that takes a long time, Leah, I would say. And it's with attention, it's with focus, it's with intention that I believe we can start to cultivate those practices and come home to ourselves, rather than, looking out there for all the answers and watching what everybody else is doing, because that's also the modern day scourge, isn't it? Comparison.
And that's another, that I think we could talk for an hour about that in itself, couldn't we? So and you have really explained, really well, like some of the tools that are available, or some of the reasons why we might like to access tools. But do you want to kind of just explain a bit about your present kind of field of work and how that really relates to trauma? Because I know you've spoken a lot about kind of dropping into the body, embodiment, but do you want to kind of just talk to us, make that kind of for us in the audience?
So I've practiced massage therapy for about 20 years now, and I have a whole range of disciplines that I use, sports massage, Indian head massage. I do no hands massage. And through the no hands massage, which the idea is you don't use your hands, you use soft parts of your body. So you have far greater connection, far bigger, expansive skin on skin contact, which is really beautiful, because you switch off the pain receptors, switch on the pleasure receptors. There's far greater connection. So you're encouraging co-regulation then. It's through that work of Jerry Pive's no hands massage that I've come to become a trauma discharge therapist as well. And I've been doing that now for about 4 years. And that's a kind of continuation, a deeper dive into embodiment. So using the vehicle of massage therapy, but bringing in neuroscience and psychology, the work of Eric Byrne, who talks about physis, that we have this in the best conditions available, we will thrive. Like a tree grows at certain times of the year and sheds its leaves. He talks about humans having that potential and that potency to do our best given the right circumstances. And unfortunately, as we know, as humans, we don't get the right conditions at the right time sometimes. And so things get in the way of that. So drawing upon that neuroscience, as I said, and I work with the polyvagal theory really. And so use the model with my clients of this window of tolerance. And that means we can be within the window of feeling good about ourselves, showing up in the world, doing our best, thriving, feeling well. However, we can trip into hyper states, hyper arousal, which is the fight, flight, fright, going into the sympathetic arousal where we're very stressed, and that has a whole raft of physiological reactions on the body, raises our heart rate, increases our blood pressure, gets us into stress states, which manifests physically, emotionally, mentally, energetically in adverse ways. So whenever clients come to see me, whether that's for massage or trauma resolution therapy, I want to build the profile and understand what their lifestyle is, what their job is, what's their history, have they had, you know, adverse conditions gone on in their lives, you know, because we're treating the whole person at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So drawing upon those and hypo states, which we can drop into when the body can't cope with that level of stress. We can drop into depression and states of withdrawal, not wanting to mix and mingle. So it's how to bring clients into that ideal state of that window of tolerance through the body. So I work directly with the nervous system through specific massage moves, through movements. And literally, these are primal movements that talk directly to the nervous system. We don't need words. When trauma clients come to me, I don't need their whole histories, by the way, you know, because that can just trigger trauma. So the aim is to soothe the nervous system, bring the nervous system into regulation through co-regulation with myself in the presence of another. We can get regulated. And then through the movements, the massage strokes, compression work, these are primal moves that we do with babies. You know, we swaddle babies, we rock babies, and we stroke babies. And these are all specific moves and positions and postures that we use in trauma discharge therapy to bring the client into safety. And that goes for even when they come in the room. Clients might come in really angry and in their heads and wanting to tell their whole stories and splurge and just bleed all over the place emotionally. And I afford them that capacity to do that and that space. But really, I'm bringing them into safety all the time. My room is simple, it's clean, it's clear. You know, there's no clutter in there. I'm in my steady state. I need to be in balance, in homeostasis myself, so that then through mirror neurons, the client eventually comes into being in their regulated state, and we have that co-regulation going on. And trauma discharge therapy, what I do is through these movements, as I've described, through these massage strokes, and I encourage clients to be in the present tense because that's where healing takes place. If they're tripping off into the past, if they're catastrophizing into the future, they've gone then. And so I do have safety protocols. If a client does get triggered, then I have the whole raft of safety protocols to bring them back into the present tense, you know, through questions, through bringing them into the present tense. And it's like a co-creative experience that they have, because I'm checking in with the client throughout their treatment. Are they okay? Are they still with me? And this is where trauma discharge takes place, in the present tense, in safety. You know, trauma release can only happen in safety. And if they drop into their bodies, maybe for the first time in a long, long time, because they've been operating from their heads as well, externally, then they can come into the present tense, come into their bodies and feel what it feels like to feel safe. And from this moment in time, they can start to release their trauma, because it gets stuck in the nervous system. So we're literally rewiring the nervous system to get used to how it feels safe. And I talk about breathing practices to enable this to happen outside of the treatment room. And I talk about how to, you know, feel in the body and come into the body as often as possible throughout the day, let's say, so that they can take tools away with them in order to support themselves. Because of course, it's an ongoing process. It's not just coming to the treatment room and having that session. So yeah, that's trauma resolution therapy in a nutshell.
It sounds amazing, and it sounds like you're kind of working with each and every aspect of that person, but giving them the tools, because I guess those safety strategies that you were talking about are then, because we're kind of thinking about mirroring, are then something that they can bring into their lives and they can learn and embody. And so everything you are mirroring, initially you're guiding, aren't you? But I guess the behind that is for them to then self-regulate, self-guide and
feel it. Because if we don't feel it, it's great. We can all learn cognitively, can't we? It's like reading a book and thinking, okay, and you know, getting the certificate, that's it then. No, it's not. That's just the beginning. You have to feel it. And I've only learned that recently, to be honest, Leah. So I've spent my whole life avoiding feeling. And maybe everybody else gets it. I don't know. Maybe this is all new to me. So that's why I'm so, you know, enamored about it and excited about it, because for the first time, you know, as I say, at 54, I'm learning to be embodied. And it's like, wow, how lovely is it to feel safe? And my whole world has changed now. I've changed, you know, I've basically stopped looking out there. I turned around and started to look within and go within And every day I cultivate little practices for myself to keep coming back to myself, keep getting regulated. I trip out. Of course, I get stressed. I've got a 13-year-old boy at home, you know, who's going through the dreaded teenage years. And so he triggers me, I trigger him, you know, and it's how to regulate and how to keep coming back to the body somehow, you know, with little practices that we can introduce in our lives on a daily basis, because I want to give them tools as well. I don't want them to be kind of indebted or kind of, you know, trapped into this situation. It's, as I said, it's a
Oh, we've lost the sound for a second. I think the sound's gone. Okay, so we've got the sound back now.
Oh, good. We lost it there, didn't we? Oh.
It's funny, as it's things like that always happen with Zoom. But like thinking back to kind of trauma and our conversation around trauma and grief. So why do you think it's so important now? You know, why is trauma significant now in the current climate?
Yeah, it's a good one. I mean, trauma's been around forever, of course. Personally, I do think there can be stigmatization around trauma, and people are a bit embarrassed to talk about it or kind of squash it down, you know, or minimalize it, actually, let's say. You know, I've had various clients who've come in, and through the conversation, it turns out they had near-death experiences. You know, one almost died in the sea, and comes to me for headaches now. Another had whiplash, a serious car accident 20 years ago, and comes for headaches now. And so I do try and explain there is a correlation between different types of trauma. Of course, there's different types of trauma, childhood trauma, you know, chronic trauma, and then one-off incidents that occur. But trauma resides in the body, and it's there. It's called ambient trauma. It's there in the background all the time, and it'll manifest in many different ways. People come to me with tightness, tension, aches, headaches, different aches throughout the body, or they're depressed, or they've got high anxiety. Emotionally, they feel overwhelmed all the time, you know, very distressed all the time. So, or they've got no energy. So there's many ways this kind of ambient trauma manifests on an ongoing basis, and that is due to the kind of chronic nature of stress. Because stress, you know, the adrenaline, the cortisol, which is needed to keep the body in high alert, based on the original traumas, the body gets used to being in that high sense of hyper vigilance, basically. And that's the nervous system's job, to keep us safe. But we can get stuck in that paradigm. You know, adrenaline, cortisol inflames the body, causes all sorts of problems. You know, the ACE study, adverse childhood experiences, that was done on a whole raft of children in America. I think it was the 80s, the first one was done. And this was for kind of middle class, you know, kids, where you wouldn't expect there to be much trauma. But they had questions, 1 to 10, of different types of trauma. And these kids were questioned, and anybody with this 3 out of 10 and above, what happened, these kids who had trauma in childhood then went on to develop, you know, life-threatening conditions much earlier. And so what happens when trauma is in the body all the time and gets re-triggered over and over again is it's known as allostatic load. The body, the internal body, ages quicker than our chronological age, because we're not breathing deep into the belly. We're breathing up here shallowly. You know, we're ready to fight. So all that energy that we do have is going towards us being primed to flee, run away from, you know, have the fright, you know, disconnect from ourselves. And so all that energy is not getting to the core organs. So you can have cancers developing, all kinds of conditions that developed in these children at a much earlier age than their peers, who were not subjected to trauma in childhood. So if you roll that out to everybody now, what's happened in the last couple of years, of course, with the pandemic, there's been major isolation. People have been forced to really maybe face their issues where they've not been used to being able to do that in the past, because they've been so busy. We're all so busy these days. We live on the external, unfortunately. Society lauds, as I said earlier, stress. You know, it's like, I'm stressed, and it's a badge of honor almost now to be super stressed. And I think there's something about women in particular, unfortunately, where we were promised this myth of having it all, and we could have it all. and we can have it all, but there's a price to pay. You know, a lot of people my age are managing 3 generations worth of, they've got caring duties for elders and for children and for their peers. And then we're going out to work, we're running our own businesses, we're running the home, we're making sure we try and have a bit of a social life in between all of that, and then practice a bit of self-care on a Sunday at 10. You know, I think there is a huge price to pay for the fast pace of living now. So notwithstanding the pandemic, which has brought it to the fore and really raised awareness, I think, of trauma, which is fantastic. I really do appreciate there's a lot of information out there on trauma now, and it's making people think, you know, how do I want to live my life? Have I got trauma? You know, most people have trauma because it's a human condition. We can't avoid it, unfortunately. So notwithstanding stigma around it, you know, if people are talking more about it, that's brilliant. And it's fantastic what you're doing here, because it's raising awareness and it's normalizing, you know, the conditions of trauma. Most people don't come out alive, you know, having had no trauma. And if they do, they're lucky, I guess. But how busy we are these days, it's going to affect the body. We are in states of perpetual stress, actually, because we never switch off. And our nervous systems weren't built to cope with the level of information that we are accessing now 24/7. You know, we'll all do that in the middle of the night. I do it. I scroll all the time. I wake up in the night and I've got insomnia and it's like I'm straight on my phone. And I know that's the worst thing ever to do. But it's accessible and it's a quick fix, you know, and it's not helping the situation, but we all do it. And then even listening to the news, we're bombarded with trauma now as well. I mentioned right at the beginning, secondary trauma. You know, it's live. We're watching and witnessing horrors unfolding throughout the world, and it's mainstreaming live into our lives. And in a way, we have to learn to protect ourselves a bit, because our precious nervous systems aren't geared up for that level of trauma. So we can be re-traumatizing ourselves over and over again. So it's a scourge of the modern day, unfortunately, that we are prone to trauma because we can't avoid it these days unless we make a really conscious decision. And this is self-care, you know, people call it selfish, you know, and it's a bugbear of mine, because if we're not looking after ourselves at the end of the day, then we're putting the onus of responsibility on somebody else, I believe. So we're behoven to look after ourselves and to care for ourselves so that we don't end up ill and don't end up with chronic conditions. You know, we should all be looking after ourselves beautifully. And that means setting clear boundaries as well with people, with the news. I don't watch the news anymore. I'll get the headlines once a week. That's enough. I don't need to be watching the news all day, every day through some weird morphed, you know, sense of guilt. I've created a good life for myself, to be honest. And I think that's really important. And if we all did that, maybe things would change in the world. So this raising awareness of trauma now is really, really important, because I don't think any of us can avoid it. It's just there all the time. And
I think you've spoken so much about our nervous systems. I think it's worth kind of saying that our nervous systems, when they're reacting to these kind of modern issues, say, or these kind of societal issues, they don't know when the threat has gone. So there's no kind of, you know, whereas if you're in the wild, you know, or you watch a dog, if a dog kind of gets you know, scared by something or barks or kind of gets all its hair up, after that event, the dog shakes it out, doesn't it, and kind of just removes it from their body. And that's like the end of it. But for us, we're just bombarded constantly. There's no opportunity to just shake that out and think, right, it's gone, that's over. And also the opposite of fight or flight. When you're not in fight or flight, you're in rest and digest, aren't you? So it makes perfect sense. It actually, that's why kind of illnesses could manifest, or why your sleep is going to be impacted, why you're going to get stomach problems, why you're not kind of nourishing yourself with your food, because your body isn't able to rest and digest fully. It's in this kind of fight or flight system process where it's just trying to kind of digest as quick as it can and get onto the next threat, basically. It is important, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think the main thing is we don't have that co-regulation now. We're all living quite independently, and that can be a trauma response as well, being hyper independent. That's what I did for many years, built walls around me, didn't let anyone in, didn't let myself out. But now we can be so distracted. We think we're having connection through Facebook and having friends online, etc. But in the absence, and we're all busy, so it's very difficult to maintain good friendships, keep meeting up, that kind of thing. But through lack of that embodied, you know, co-regulation, the body's suffering. I talked about that big abyss and that big black hole, but that's happening all the while now for everybody, because we are sentient beings. We need to be mixing and mingling. And that's the difference between now and years back, when you had tribes, people mixing and mingling together. You had the village to raise these children. Now we're all living in our little boxes of our houses, thinking we're connecting on social media, and we're not. And we're desperately lonely. You know, we need to be mixing and mingling with people to feel safe. And again, it's the nervous system regulation. It comes through co-regulation. And especially for people who've been traumatized, they didn't get that co-regulation, maybe from their primary caregivers. So they never learned how to do it. So you've got all of these people, we're constantly getting bombarded with information and distraction, but trauma begets trauma. So we're just building on trauma strategies that are not serving us particularly, when really we're just human beings. We're animals who need to be mixing and mingling and touching, which is why my work feels so important, because it's that righteous, safe, trauma-informed touch that people don't get. You know, people report to me when they have trauma discharge therapy about having the hugs from the grandma. That's what it reminds them of. Or them hugs from mum when they were a little boy. You know, and this is the experience. To me, it's spiritual, because it's allowing them to connect with their own humaneness at the end of the day. I don't mean spiritual as in woo-woo out there, but in the body. That's where spirituality is, having that holy communion with ourselves, connected to ourselves. We're here on planet Earth. You know, I don't advocate, you know, going off and having trips and disappearing and going into intergalactic spaces, all of that kind of thing, which seems quite popular at the moment. But for me, it's in the body. You know, we're having an embodied experience on this planet, and yet we're expected to become superhumans. But the massive price to pay is that humaneness ultimately, and that gift of connection, you know.
And do you think that's where you offer sister circles, don't you? Do you think that's kind of where that's that's come in for you?
It has actually, because my sister circles involve embodiment practices. You know, I follow Prune Harris's work, energetic work, and I share practices that bring us, you know, my big strapline is the body wisdom. So encouraging sisters who come to the circles through these embodiment practices to tune in to their bodies, because that's where the wisdom lies, and get out of their heads literally through the practices that we do together. And then, you know, when they're in the bodies, then we do the sister share, and people open up a lot more, and then they feel safe. You see, I've brought them into safety through these practices, and then they feel able to share and share human stories. And that's the connection which is missing nowadays, unfortunately.
And I guess it's again that opportunity to regulate with each other, to kind of tune in to that energy, like all of us, kind of all of them in the group, just kind of dropping in, their body dropping into this kind of energy, this homeostasis, this balance. And then kind of once you kind of the more you touch into that, the more it kind of, the stronger, I suppose, it becomes like a muscle, isn't it? The more.
Absolutely. And everybody has a different story, of course, but ultimately the human feelings, the emotions are all the same. So through sharing stories, the story might be different, but you'll resonate in the body in a similar way, you know. So that's the significance. And then we feel aligned to others, and then we feel connected to others, because it's like, gosh, I feel you, you know, and I feel myself as well. So it's giving that opportunity and that permission almost to drop out of the awareness and into the body and connect in that way. So it's quite a beautiful experience, actually.
It sounds really lovely.
It is.
So before we end, do you want to kind of give us a bit of an understanding of the services you offer then? So I know that you're you can kind of talk to us about where in the country you are. I know you're in different places, but also you do offer online services, don't you, as well?
So I'm based in the northwest of England, north of Wigan, in a place called Standish, and I have a treatment room there in the hot yoga centre. Which is great. And I offer a range of body therapies. So standard massage, no hands massage, Indian head massage. I offer different techniques, sports massage. So I really understand the body intimately, you know, and how to help people with different conditions, different injuries. People come to me for surgery as well. And I offer something called targeted cryotherapy, which supports with inflammation, but also helps people with trauma, because I apply that to the spine, and that regulates the nervous system as well and brings that into balance. I do the trauma regulation therapy, which is, you know, they come for 5 sessions maybe, or a one-off, and that is a deeper dive. into supporting them with their trauma specifically. Although in my view, everybody's kind of got some trauma at some level. And so when I do my standard massages, I'm talking about nervous system regulation already. I feel, you know, behoven to share the information that I have with clients. I check where they're at, because you always meet the client where they're at. I don't want to bombard them and confuse them and cause more trauma, you know. So I always meet the client where they are at and kind of communicate at their level. And then at home, I have a couple of therapy rooms downstairs in my home, and that's where I offer feminine embodiment coaching. And that again is a deeper dive for women to come, have the space, capacity, opportunity to talk more deeply and connect with themselves using embodiment practices as well. And then they can have a beautiful treatment as well. And that supports women with body dysmorphia, body issues, coming to terms with themselves, coming home to their bodies and allowing for that to take place as well. And then once a month, I do these sister circles locally. But people, if they want to find me, if they're across the country and have a chat and see if I can support them, then I can offer online sessions as well, Leah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And we can put the links to all your social media and your website in the show notes, so people will be able to find you or drop you an email.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for that. Great.
Well, it's been amazing. I've really enjoyed listening, and it's definitely something I'd love to learn more about. So I'm sure you'll hear from me as well.
Good, fantastic. Well, you're doing your yoga work, of course, so it's the same, isn't it? I mean, I always say at the end of the day, whether it's yoga, whether it's, you know, meditation, mindfulness, ultimately we're coming back to the body and using the vehicle of the breath to get out of the mind into the body and become present and be embodied then. You know, whatever the vehicle is, it all helps at the end of the day, definitely.
And I always think there's a reason why these teachings have been passed down for thousands of years.
Absolutely.
You know, there's a similar, a golden thread through all of them for a reason, isn't there? Because they work.
Yes.
For thousands of years we've been valuing them. So
definitely.
Oh, well, it's been amazing. And again, I'm just going to remind everyone that it is a fundraising event, so there'll be a link to Great Ormond Street's fundraising page there for anyone who'd like to make a donation. But thank you so much, Jan. It's been amazing having you
Thank
involved.
you, Leah, and thank you for this work, this profile raising work you're doing, because it's fantastic. It really is. Well done.
I think it's funny, these kind of things come from the heart, I think, and you just kind of it's something that's been really important to me to get off the ground. I'll definitely do it regularly as well.
Good.
I'll make sure
Okay.
stuff like
Fantastic.
that.
Great. All right,
thank
Leah.
You so much.
Thank you so much.